My son Julian, in his $3,000 suit and a look worth less than a penny, pointed through the flawless glass of the living room to the perfectly manicured garden. His eyes, cold as the marble beneath my bare feet, did not meet mine. They fixed on a specific point, a small refuge of mahogany and miniature tiles that my late husband had built for our deceased golden retriever, Atlas. The doghouse, more luxurious than my first apartment, glistened under the California sun. The silence in the Bel Air mansion was heavy, dense, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower on some other opulent property. I felt every one of my 76 years weighing on my shoulders, curving my spine not with age, but with the crushing force of humiliation. The cardboard boxes with the fragments of my life, yellowed photographs, a couple of paperbacks, the faded cardigan I used to wear, were stacked near the door like trash waiting to be collected. Julian finally turned to me, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Father always said this is where you belonged," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, as if he were closing a business deal. "To me, it's just a doghouse, but for you, maybe it's an upgrade." The brutality of those words hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give him that satisfaction. In that moment, looking at the canine shelter he offered me as a final dwelling, something inside me broke and at the same time solidified. The fragile woman who had lived in the shadow of an authoritarian husband and who had erased herself for an ungrateful son began to disappear, replaced by a cold, cutting clarity. He believed he was sentencing me to oblivion, to a pathetic end. Little did he know that by pushing me to the lowest point of my existence, he was, in fact, giving me the one thing I never had: freedom, the freedom to owe nothing to anyone. And it was there, in that deafening silence of cruelty, that I made a decision. My future would not be defined by that doghouse, but by the palace of dignity I would build with the stones he was throwing at me. If you love Jesus and believe that this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of stories of healing and wisdom. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation. I ask that you join our community of souls who have gone through something similar. The 24 hours my son gave me evaporated like dew under the merciless Los Angeles sun. The transition from the Bel Air mansion to the St. Jude public shelter in the forgotten heart of Boyle Heights was a blur of forms, humiliating questions, and the pervasive smell of disinfectant mixed with cabbage soup. My new home was a room I shared with 3 other women, each with an ocean of loss in her eyes. My bed, with its thin mattress that allowed me to feel the metal frame, underneath, had a view of a graffiti-covered brick wall. Luxury was now a single pillow and a rough blanket that smelled of mothballs. In the first few days, I was a ghost. I would sit in the cracked vinyl chair of the common room, watching the ebb and flow of life around me. The constant sound of an old television, always tuned to a shrill game show, formed the soundtrack of our invisibility. No one there was the wife of, the mother of, or the owner of anymore. We were just names on a clipboard, mouths to be fed, bodies to be sheltered. I moved through the worn linoleum hallways with a silence that was familiar to me, but which now had a different weight. Before, my silence was a form of submission. Here, it was armor. I observed the faces of my companions, saw the same lines of worry and resignation that surely marked my own. We were a silent club of women who had built homes for others and now had none for ourselves. The humiliation was not a single, deafening event. It was a constant mist, the persistent reminder that I had become a burden, a discarded piece, exactly as my son saw me. I was the 76-year-old woman who had nowhere to go. A week later, the humiliation took on a new, tangible form. I was in the courtyard, a small concrete area with a few pots of dying plants, trying to feel the warmth of the sun on my face, when they arrived. 2 men, young enough to be my grandsons, dressed in identical gray suits that seemed to scream money in the dignified poverty of St. Jude. They walked towards me, their Italian shoes making a strange, out-of-place sound on the cracked cement. Everyone in the common room, which had a window to the courtyard, stopped what they were doing. The conversation ceased. The gazes turned. I became the center of an unwanted spectacle. They were Julian's lawyers. The taller one, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, held out an envelope. "Mrs. Vance," he said, the formality sounding like an insult. "Julian is very concerned about your well-being. He sent us to offer you this, a generous settlement to ensure you can find a more suitable place." He didn't need to say more. The message was clear. Take this money and disappear. The offer was an insignificant amount, enough to keep me out of his sight and conscience for a few months. The stares of the other residents burned my back, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were witnessing my downfall in real time. I looked at the lawyers, impeccably manicured hands, at the white envelope containing the price of my silence, and then at his face. For the first time in decades, a strength I didn't recognize rose up my spine. In a firm, though quiet voice, I said only one word: no. The shock on their faces was almost comical. They muttered a veiled threat about questioning my mental capacity, and retreated, leaving behind an even heavier silence. In that instant, exposed under everyone's gaze, I did not feel shame. I felt the first glimmer of fury, and with it, the understanding that my son had made a terrible mistake. He thought I was finished, but he had only taught me how to fight. To understand Julian's cruelty, one must understand the house in which he was raised. My marriage to Richard Vance was not a partnership. It was a service contract I silently signed for 50 years. Richard was a man forged in steel and ambition, a magnate who saw the world as a chessboard, and people, including me, as pawns. I was the trophy wife, the perfect hostess, the silent administrator of his Bel Air fortress. My role was to be invisible and efficient, to ensure his suits were always impeccable and his whiskey was always just right. On this barren soil of affection, Julian was the only flower I tried to cultivate. All the love I couldn't give my husband, I poured onto my son. I remember spending sleepless nights sewing superhero costumes for him, secretly selling a small piece of jewelry I inherited from my mother to buy him the telescope he so desperately wanted. I was his one-person audience for his school plays, the nurse for his colds, the keeper of his childhood secrets. Each small sacrifice was a declaration of love, a brick I laid in the foundation of his life, foolishly believing I was building a refuge for us both. I erased myself, so he could be everything. Richard's world was made of numbers and power. Mine was made of the smell of cake in the oven, the sound of his feet running down the hall, and the blind faith that my unconditional love would one day be my reward. Julian grew up bathed in privilege, but starved of true paternal attention. Richard gave him cars, trips, and a bank account, but he never gave him his time. It was I who taught him to ride a bike, who read to him before bed, who hugged him when he had nightmares. However, Richard's shadow was long and powerful. From an early age, my husband taught Julian that vulnerability was a disease, and empathy was a luxury for the weak. I vividly remember a dinner, when Julian was perhaps 12. I had expressed an opinion about politics, something I had read in one of my books. Richard stopped eating, put down his silverware with a clang, and said, looking at Julian but speaking to me, "Your mother has a good heart, son. It's a shame she doesn't have a brain to go with it. Remember, in life, you either listen to people like me, who build empires, or you end up like people like her, who clean the house." I saw the shame in my son's eyes, but it wasn't shame for his father. It was shame for me. In that moment, he did not defend me. He learned his lesson. He began to see my love not as a strength, but as a weakness, a trait he needed to distance himself from to gain his father's approval. The seed of coldness was planted there, at the mahogany dining table, and watered by years of casual contempt and lessons in power. As Julian became a man and was absorbed into the family business, the emotional distance between us turned into a chasm. He became a carbon copy of his father, but without the hint of reluctant respect Richard sometimes showed me. To Julian, I was a relic of a past that didn't fit into his life of private jets, board meetings, and Beverly Hills socialites. The transformation was gradual and painful. It started with small criticisms. "Mother, that dress makes you look like a peasant," he would say when I tried to dress up for one of his rare dinners at home. Then, it evolved into deliberate exclusion. He would ask me to dine in my room when he brought important guests over, claiming the topics were too complex for me to understand. The truth is, he was ashamed of me, ashamed of my simplicity, of my hands that were never made for holding champagne flutes, but for tending to his fevers. Each gesture of exclusion was like a small cut, and over the years, I bled in silence, convincing myself it was a phase, that the loving boy I had raised was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of arrogance and expensive suits. Loneliness became my constant companion, even living in a mansion with over 20 rooms. When Richard died of a massive heart attack, a part of me thought that maybe, just maybe, the absence of that domineering force might bring Julian closer to me. I was dead wrong. For my son, his father's death was not a loss. It was a promotion. He didn't offer me a shoulder to cry on. He offered me papers to sign. Overnight, he became the absolute master of the Vance Empire and, by extension, of my life. With frightening efficiency, he took control of everything. He fired the housekeeper who had been with me for 30 years, citing cost cuts, and hired a staff that reported directly to him. He began to manage my finances, giving me a humiliating allowance as if I were a child, insisting it was to protect me from opportunists. My mail was intercepted. Decisions were made without my consultation. I became a gilded prisoner, living in the house I helped build, but with no power over anything. He isolated me from the world under the pretext of care, clipping my wings while smiling and saying it was for my own good. The powerlessness was a slow poison, and each day I felt weaker, more invisible, a ghost wandering the halls of my own life. The first public humiliation he orchestrated happened a few months after the funeral. Julian decided to throw a grand party at the mansion to solidify his new position in Los Angeles' social circle. I spent the entire day in my room, listening to the sounds of preparation, feeling like a stranger. Naively, I thought he would want me, as his mother and Richard's widow, to be present to greet the guests. I put on my best dress, a simple blue silk model, and came downstairs just as the first guests were arriving. Julian saw me at the foot of the staircase, his face transforming into a mask of contained fury. He walked quickly towards me, grabbed my arm with a force that made me flinch, and with a fake smile for an approaching couple, he whispered in my ear, his voice a hissing poison, "What do you think you're doing? Go back to your room. Now. Your place isn't down here, getting in the way of important people. You're a dead weight in these conversations. Just stay out of sight." He turned me around and pushed me gently, but firmly, towards the stairs. The guests saw it all, the matriarch of the family being dismissed like an inconvenient servant. I climbed each step with tears finally, streaming down my face, the sound of music and laughter from below marking the soundtrack of my total and utter erasure. The following months were a succession of degradations. The final blow, before kicking me out, was the cruelest. He started bringing real estate agents to appraise the mansion without even telling me. They would walk into my room, measuring walls and discussing renovations, while I sat in my armchair, pretending to read a book. Julian would accompany them, speaking about me, in the third person as if I weren't there. "Don't worry about her belongings," I heard him say to an agent in the hallway. "This entire wing will be cleared out. The former occupant is just part of the estate that needs to be managed." Occupant, estate. I was no longer a person. I was an item on an inventory list, a problem to be solved. That night, feeling the end was near, I sought comfort in old memories. I went to Richard's study, a room Julian barely used, and started rummaging through a box of old documents the lawyers had overlooked. I just wanted to find an old photograph, something to remind me of a simpler time. But tucked inside an old accounting ledger, I found something else. A thick, yellowed envelope, sealed with wax, with my name written in my late husband's strong, angular handwriting. My hands trembled as I held it. I didn't know what to expect. Perhaps a final word of contempt. But in that envelope, sealed more than a decade ago, was a truth my son had worked so hard to bury. A truth that would change absolutely everything. With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal my husband had pressed more than a decade ago. The paper inside the envelope was thick, expensive, and Richard's handwriting, a series of aggressive peaks and valleys, was unmistakable. There were two documents. The first was a personal letter. The words were not of love. Richard was incapable of that. But they contained a kind of brutally honest recognition he never granted me in life. He wrote that he knew Julian had the greed of a shark and the loyalty of a snake, and that without his iron fist to control him, my son would likely consume me. For that reason, he had acted. The second document was the legal proof of that action. The deed to an irrevocable trust fund, established in my name, completely separate from the main Vance family estate. It was a substantial fortune, a lifelong multi-million-dollar pension, designed to be untouchable by anyone, especially Julian. And there was more. Attached to the trust was the deed to a small house in Pasadena, a property Richard had bought early in his career, and which, according to the letter, was the only place where he could still breathe. He bequeathed both to me, with a final clause that was both a command and a gift. Live for yourself, Eleanor. It's the only debt you never paid me. The weight of those papers in my hands was immense, not for the monetary value, but for the weight of the truth. I was never powerless. I just didn't know my own power. I spent that night awake in my narrow bed at the shelter, the moonlight illuminating the documents spread over the rough blanket. I didn't feel a burst of joy, but rather a deep, seismic realignment of my soul. It was as if the woman I had been for 76 years, the submissive wife, the self-sacrificing mother, the silent victim, had disintegrated into dust, and from the ashes, a new Eleanor was emerging, hesitant but upright. Every humiliation, every cruel word from Julian, every act of erasure I had suffered passed before my eyes. But now they no longer hurt me. They were just facts from a past life, someone else's story. My husband's revelation was not just about money or a house. It was a posthumous permission to exist. The quiet dignity I had been cultivating at the shelter, the small seed of self-respect that sprouted when I refused the money from Julian's lawyers, now blossomed into a tree of unshakable resolve. Fear, which had been my constant companion my entire life, simply evaporated. In its place, there was a cold calm and an absolute clarity about what I needed to do. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge was a petty emotion, a game Julian would play. Mine would be an act of creation, of justice, and of rebirth. I wasn't going to destroy his world. I was going to build mine. The catalyst for my action came 3 days later, in the form of tears. I found Maria, the director of St. Jude, crying in her small office. She told me, her voice choked with emotion, that the shelter had lost its main funder and had received an eviction notice. In 30 days, the doors would be closed and all the residents, my new friends, my new soul family, would be on the street. The despair on her face was a mirror of what I felt when Julian pointed me to the doghouse. That same afternoon, I saw a poster on the community bulletin board. It announced a last-minute fundraising event to Save St. Jude, and there, in large letters stamped over a smiling photo, was the name of the guest of honor and the evening's main donor, Julian Vance. The irony was so cruel, so grotesque, that I almost laughed. My son, the man who made me homeless, was using the imminent homelessness of dozens of seniors to polish his public image as a philanthropist. It was in that moment that my plan solidified. I talked to some of the other residents, told them a summarized version of my story. I saw in their eyes not pity, but a spark of fight. They gave me the strength I needed. I would go to that event. Julian wanted a spectacle. I would give him one he would never forget. The event was exactly as I imagined, a sea of rich, tanned faces, champagne glasses, and fake smiles, all taking place in a rented hall that contrasted painfully with the decaying reality of the shelter they intended to save. I entered through the back door, wearing a dress borrowed from one of my roommates, and kept to the shadows, watching. Julian took the stage, impeccable as always, and began to speak with rehearsed sincerity about the importance of caring for our elders, of honoring the generation that built our city. When he picked up the giant check for the press photo, my heart began to pound. It was my turn. I walked steadily towards the stage, ignoring the security guards who tried to stop me. Someone in the audience recognized me from the shelter and shouted my name. The buzz began. I took the microphone that a stunned assistant offered me. I looked directly at my son, whose face had become a mask of fury and panic. "Good evening," I began, my voice surprisingly steady. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am Julian's mother. I am also, for the past 3 weeks, a resident of the St. Jude shelter." A collective gasp went through the room. "Julian talks about honoring the elderly. I want to tell you how he honored me. He honored me by throwing me out of the house where I lived for 50 years. He honored me by offering me our dog's house as a home. You inherited $90 million and an empty house, Julian. But here, at St. Jude, with these people, I inherited something your money can never buy: love and a home. You left me a doghouse, and with it, you gave me the freedom to build a palace of humanity." The silence in the hall was absolute, so heavy it seemed to have a physical form. Every camera, every pair of eyes was fixed on me, and then on Julian. His public relations smile had melted, revealing the ugly, cruel man beneath. He stood paralyzed, exposed under the bright lights, his philanthropic charade shattered on national television. The first sound was a single person clapping, then another, and within seconds, the entire room erupted in thunderous applause, not for him, but for me. The reporters surged forward, but I simply placed the microphone back on its stand and began to walk off the stage. Julian was surrounded by his team and whisked away, his night of glory transformed into a public relations nightmare. In the middle of the crowd, a distinguished-looking man extended his hand to me. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his eyes filled with a gentle intensity. "My name is Arthur Covington. I'm an attorney. I was deeply moved by your story. I would like to review your case, pro bono." He handed me his card. In that moment, surrounded by the support of strangers and the gratitude of my friends from the shelter, I felt the power of truth. Julian thought the night would end with his picture in the papers as a hero. He was wrong. The night ended with the truth. And the next morning, with that lawyer's card in my hand and a forgotten fortune within my reach, what I did would not only surprise my son, but would leave the entire city of Los Angeles speechless. We would like to feel your presence right now. Please write in the comments which city you are watching us from and what time it is there now. By doing this, we create a network of energy and support for this story, a reminder that we are not alone in our battles. Each comment is a point of light in our healing process. Okay, the story is heading towards its conclusion. Here is the block with the ending. Act 5. Inspiring Outcome. The next morning, the Los Angeles sun seemed different. It was no longer the oppressive glare that exposed the flaws of an empty life, but a warm light that promised a new day. Accompanied by Mr. Covington, who refused to leave my side, the first call I made was not to the press or to confront my son. It was to the Swiss bank my late husband had mentioned in the letter. The voice on the other end of the line was initially skeptical, but as Mr. Covington provided the codes and passwords from the document, the tone shifted from doubt to almost reverential respect. In less than an hour, I, Eleanor Vance, the woman who just days ago was counting coins to buy coffee from the shelter's vending machine, was officially verified as the sole owner of a fortune I could barely comprehend. The process was quiet, methodical, and incredibly empowering. There were no shouts of victory, just the quiet, profound satisfaction of seeing my name printed on legal documents that gave me back not only my wealth, but my identity. Simultaneously, Mr. Covington filed the lawsuit against Julian. It was not an act of revenge, it was an act of order. It was like tidying up a terribly messy room, putting things back in their proper place. Justice, I was learning, didn't have to be loud to be effective. The media firestorm that descended upon Julian was immediate and relentless. The story of the doghouse grandma, as one tabloid nicknamed me, was irresistible. The video of my speech at the gala went viral, and the image of Julian, pale and exposed, was replayed endlessly. His businesses began to suffer, partners distanced themselves, and the Vance name, once synonymous with power, was now stained with shame. Pressured from all sides and facing the prospect of a trial that would ruin him completely, he capitulated. His lawyers contacted Mr. Covington and agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement, paying every penny of the arrears from the trust fund, plus a substantial amount for emotional distress. I never spoke to him again. I didn't need to. His punishment was not prison or total poverty, but something far worse for a man like him, the loss of status. He remained in his cold mansion, a deposed king in a kingdom of one, surrounded by riches that now only served to remind him of what he had lost, any shred of honor or humanity. His cruelty did not lead him to a theatrical ruin, but to a life of gilded irrelevance, which, for him, was a private hell. My first act as a woman of means was not to look for a new mansion for myself. It was to save my home. I scheduled a meeting with the real estate corporation that was about to evict my friends. I walked into the glass and steel boardroom, not with the stooped posture of a beggar, but with the calm authority of an investor. They expected a negotiation, perhaps an emotional appeal. Instead, after they presented their plans to demolish the building and construct luxury apartments, I simply slid a purchase proposal across the polished mahogany table, a cash offer, above market value, to acquire the building and the land, effective immediately. The silence in the room was deafening. The executives looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and admiration. That day, I didn't just buy a building. I bought the future. I bought security for dozens of forgotten souls. I left that room not as Mrs. Vance of Bel Air, but as Eleanor, the protector of St. Jude, and that identity was infinitely more valuable. The transaction was completed in a week. The pen I used to sign the papers felt more powerful than any jewel I had ever worn. The transformation of the shelter began immediately, and it was a collective labor of love. The stained walls were painted in warm shades of yellow and green. The cracked linoleum was replaced with safe, non-slip flooring. New beds, comfortable mattresses, and soft blankets arrived on trucks. But the biggest change happened in the concrete courtyard. I hired a team of landscape architects, and together, we, the residents, transformed that sterile space into a vibrant garden. We planted rose bushes, lavender, sunflowers, and a small vegetable patch with tomatoes and herbs. Each resident had their own plot to tend. The name St. Jude was removed from the facade. In its place, a carved wooden sign was erected, bearing the words, "The Fresh Start Home." The name was chosen in a vote among all of us. It was no longer a place of endings, but of new beginnings. I was not a distant benefactor. I worked alongside them every day, my hands in the dirt, feeling life pulse beneath my fingernails. The Bel Air mansion was a museum of dead luxury. The Fresh Start Home was a hive of life, noisy, imperfect, and absolutely wonderful. My personal life blossomed in a way I never imagined possible. I officially became the executive director of the Fresh Start Home, but my real title was simply Eleanor. And most importantly, I became a grandmother. Leo, the grandson of one of the residents, the boy who offered me a drawing of a flower when I had nothing, became the light of my life. His grandmother was happy to share her grandson with me, seeing the joy our friendship brought to both of us. He visited me every day after school. We read together in the garden. I helped him with his homework, and he told me about his dreams of becoming an astronaut. He saw me not as a frail old lady, but as his friend, his confidant. For the first time, I was experiencing family love without the chains of obligation or the poison of transaction. It was a pure love, freely given and received. The family I built at the Fresh Start home was more real and stronger than the blood family that discarded me. Julian took the title of mother from me, but fate, in its infinite wisdom, gave me the gift of being a grandmother. One late afternoon, sitting on a bench in our garden, I watched Leo watering the tomatoes with a charming, childlike seriousness. The air was fragrant with the smell of wet earth and roses. Around me, other residents chatted, laughed, tended to their plants. The sound was not the oppressive silence of the mansion, but a symphony of life. I thought of Julian, alone in his marble fortress, and I felt no anger, not even pity. I felt only a vast distance, as if he belonged to a completely different universe. He took a house from me, but forced me to find a home. He took my last name from me, but forced me to build my own name. Julian was left with a mansion of marble and silence. I was left with a noisy garden, full of laughter and hands dirty with soil. Today I don't have the luxury that the Vance name once gave me, but I have the respect I earned for myself, and that, no one, ever again, can take away from me.